Hello everyone, Phoenix Knight here. Welcome to the channel, and welcome to a new video on the channel. It's time once again for our next monthly recap. I'm going to do the format of this recap a little bit different. So last month's recap, I just talked about the games from like a 10,000 foot view of, hey, here's what I played on the channel, but I didn't really talk too much about the actual games. So now this time we're actually going to spend a little bit of time on each individual game. And it was another good month on the channel. Of the 8 games I played on the channel last month, 6 were actually new to the channel. And I also leaned into my Tack Up Wargaming list pretty hard, playing a full half of the games on my list in February. And it helped that I wasn't encumbered by an Arkham Horror card game campaign, because that tends to eat a lot of the month. In addition to talking about the games, I do also want to talk about the future of the new Mystical Munchies segment on the channel. So with that, let's go into the game recap first. So the first game we played last month was also the first game on the Tack Up Wargaming list, was On to Moscow. So that was a book game from Worthington Games, where we take control of the Axis forces trying to advance into the Soviet Union during World War II, and we kind of got hammered pretty hard in that game. We ended up in a situation where the Soviets actually scored a victory in 1944, so it wasn't completely historically accurate, where they ended up with communism dominating Europe. I do like it as a travel game. It's a good travel game for that. It's very light, being that all you need for it is the book, a pencil or a pen, a couple of dice to play. So it's good for that. I did also like its thematic accuracy, with having to occasionally stop to rest and refit your troops, where you can't just keep advancing nonstop. That being said, I did have some frustration with the resource point rules, as you probably saw in the video, where I ended up with several turns with having like 1 or 2 resource point actions. I think I had a total of 7 actions where I was at 3 or above in terms of the resource points that I had to work with. So I'm thinking I may house rule that when I get this on the channel again, but I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself on that. Where I'm thinking it might be like 1 gives me 1 resource point, 2 gives me 2, then 3 to 4 gives me 3, and 5 to 6 gives me 4. Of course, there's no guarantee it'll feel more forgiving than that, because there's plenty that can go wrong, especially when you get into the events as well. That being said, that was actually one of my other frustrations with the game, where I ended up in a situation a few times where I would roll 1 to 2 resource points. Usually this would happen when I would roll 1. I'd set up to advance on a front, but then the event would either wipe out the advance or make it physically impossible to advance. Like when I was there were a couple times when I was sitting outside of Leningrad and I needed a 6 to advance, but I'd end up with an event where it gave me a negative dice roll modifier on trying to advance. So at that point I was just like, no, there's no point in even trying to advance, because even if I deploy the reserves, I physically can't get into Leningrad on this turn. So that was kind of frustrating, and that I might house rule that as well, to be a case where if you only have 1 action and an event or other effect wipes out a possible advance or makes it physically impossible to advance, then you get a +1 modifier on that until you actually succeed in advancing. Like I said, that's another house rule I might have to play around with, but that's me kind of thinking ahead on that. And of course, being a book game where you only need dice, there's a lot of chance built into it inherently. Almost, I would say, too much for sake of simplicity, but it is a good travel game. It does what it's trying to do, so I'm not going to knock it too much for that. But anyway, let's talk about the next game on the channel that we played, Dune Imperium. The second game we played on the channel was actually a Sunday game. It was Dune Imperium from Direwolf Digital. This is one where we take control of one of the leaders in the Dune universe, trying to take control of the spice on the desert world of Arrakis. This one's a combination deck builder worker placement. Now, early in my board game career, worker placement was one of those mechanics that I kind of hesitated around that because it almost had a very, I don't want to say Euro feeling to it, but it kind of gives off that. Worker placement to me kind of gives off of that Euro vibe, if that makes sense. But I did like the deck building aspect in Dune Imperium, and I think it's the right mix here of worker placement and the deck building that really lets me enjoy Dune Imperium. Now, our playthrough of it was actually a fairly tight game toward the end, where Earl Memnon Thorvald kind of blindsided me a little bit and stole the game right out from under me. That being said, I do like that there are catch-up mechanics in the game, where the later conflicts potentially give you 2 victory points. So basically you're still very much in the game as long as you've built somewhat decently well throughout the course of the game. It is a very thematic game, so you do feel like you're really in the Dune universe, and I really like anything that really immerses you in the theme of the game. This is one that I could probably also fit very easily on like a weeknight video, because it feels like the couple of times I've played Dune Imperium, it's always clocked in at the same length, about that hour and a half, maybe just a shade over mark. And that's usually about where I want to be when it comes to, okay, what goes into making a good weeknight video. So that's something I can maybe play around with later on in the channel. I did play with the Rise of Ix expansion as well, and that really added a lot to the game. The Dreadnoughts I thought were very interesting. The tech tiles helped you kind of strategize a little bit more. I don't want to call it a knock, but one thing to note if you play with the Rise of Ix expansion, is it might be a little bit easier to make Solari in the base game, so do keep that in mind. There are still ways to make Solari if you're playing with the base game, but bear in mind that it might be a little easier to make Solari if you're playing the base game than when you're playing with Rise of Ix. So just one thing to keep in mind there. It doesn't really knock my enjoyment of the game. Next time I play Dune Imperium, I'm probably going to play around with the new Immortality expansion. I haven't had a chance to play around with that yet, so something I do want to keep an eye on. But that will do it for talking about Dune Imperium. Now let's go through the Starfinder Beginner Box Solo Adventure. Starfinder's Solo Beginner Box Adventure was basically another solo tabletop RPG in the veins of A Call of Cthulhu, or even some of the Dungeons & Dragons fan-made modules that might have come out in the past. Now, I did actually kind of like the Starfinder setting, where it's almost like a space D&D kind of. Maybe that's an overly simplistic view, but that's what I'm going to go with, where it's like I said, it's a space D&D game. So it's basically you live in a D20 system and just go through a normal adventure. That being said, I did not like the adventure itself, where I ended up actually doing everything slightly out of order. So I ended up stuck in a hallway loop because my enemies were dead. So there was no way to get out of the adventure until I figured out that I was stuck in that loop, and I was like, okay, now we need to kind of house rule this to get out of the adventure. Just basically via house rule, kind of forcing the issue, however you want to put it. So I did explore it later, just to kind of go poke around with maybe jumping into an adventure. I ultimately decided not to, because I'm not really sure how I can make the schedule work on that. I'm just finding it very hard to get into any kind of tabletop RPG. I definitely do want to do more with Call of Cthulhu, but that's something I'll have to look into later. So next up, we actually continued with the Tack Up Wargaming list, and we played another new game to the channel. I should have mentioned that both On to Moscow and the Starfinder Beginner Box Solo Adventure were new to the channel, as was our next game, Field Commander Rommel. Field Commander Rommel from Dan Versen Games. You take control of the Axis forces led by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, going through some of his various campaigns. We played through Ghost Division on the channel, but there's also El Alamein and D-Day, both of which I'm scheduling to play on the channel later this year, so feel free to look out for those. Now, There are some additional challenges on the campaigns which can potentially help for replayability. I kind of go back and forth a little bit on whether I think there's a lot of replayability or not much in this game. Because on the one hand, you've got only 3 maps, so there's not a lot of replayability there. But like I mentioned, each map actually has replayability, has other challenges to it, so that helps the replayability. So I think I'm going to kind of, like I said, I go back and forth on that, but I'm going to say that there's a lot of game in this box, so definitely a lot to sink your teeth into. It is a lighter game, a little bit more in-depth than On to Moscow as an example. So there's, like I said, there's a lot here to sink your teeth into. It's a good one for travel, and it gives you a little bit more depth than the book games do, where there's a little bit of strategy to how you deploy your troops, and there's not so much chance inherent in this game. I mean, there is a 6-sided die included, and you roll for attacks and defense. But like I said, there's a little more strategy involved in this one than with the book games, where I think the book games are, almost in the name of simplicity, a little bit too chance-based for my tastes. But like I said, all good for travel. So speaking of travel, we had another game that I've played before on the channel in Final Girl. Final Girl from Dan Ryder Games, you get dumped into your own private horror movie where you play as a final girl against a killer, and your goal, hence the name, is basically to kill the killer. So there is a modular setup where you set up a killer and his location together. You shuffle everything together, meld it together, and that's your game. You pick out your final girl and all that. So you're moving through the various locations, trying to survive with trying to kill the killer. So I actually had to play this game. I actually played this game twice because my first playthrough I was making some pretty significant mistakes. So I ended up having that Friday off, and I reshot the playthrough on that. So I did a couple playthroughs of that just to kind of solve my own conscience and help get that all straight. But it did kind of make me want to get something off my chest, where I have never been allergic to constructive criticism. If there's something you guys think if there's something I'm doing wrong in a gameplay on the channel, or there's something you think I can do better with filming, whether it's, hey, move this light a little bit closer, or, hey, maybe adjust this camera angle when you get up on the table, something like that, I will always welcome that feedback in the comments below, as long as you keep it constructive. What I will not welcome, however, are personal insults and attacks, whether you aim them at me or somebody else. I will delete those when I see them, and I had somebody actually go off on the first playthrough pretty significantly, where I was getting ready to thank him for the feedback and say, hey, hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for the feedback, I'll try to do better. Obviously I can't retcon anything because the video's done, but when I went to thank him, then I saw the personal insults. I was like, yeah, no, we gotta get these comments off the channel. That being said, however, I did kind of want to mention a couple things that sprung up from that. Where one thing, obviously, is I do need to play this more off the channel, especially when I feature new killers and new locations, just to get the feel for it before I bring it on channel again. But it also kind of told me that this game is actually a little bit on the fiddly side for its size, where it's a little bit on the small side, but there's actually a lot to remember with this game. And I don't know if a game this size really needs 5 phases. I mean, yes, it's thematic, but it's a lot to remember, and for a game this size, I'd almost think it's something in the Arkham Horror files with how much fiddliness there is to it. Like I said, in the bigger games, I don't really mind having extra fiddliness so much, but it bothers me a bit when you look at something this small. That said, it is very immersive and thematic, and I do like that. I'm kind of going back and forth on if I want to get this one on the channel again. Like I said, there's a lot of fiddliness to it that kind of bothers me, but I'm kind of rambling on that, so let's go into our next game, which was also new to the channel, and these last 3 games were on my TACAP Wargaming list. Let's go first to Star Wars Imperial Assault. Star Wars Imperial Assault from Fantasy Flight Games is a game where you get dumped into a campaign after the destruction of the first Death Star, Literally, the first scenario of the campaign that we played, which is, I believe, Flight of the Freedom Fighter or something like that, was on Yavin 4, and we had to escape from the enemies and get off the planet. I do like the idea of the campaign, and it seems like it's going to be a very easy one to grasp. It definitely helped that I had to learn to play, that there was not only a learn to play book in the box, but there was also a tutorial campaign on the app. So I was able to play through that and work everything through pretty well. Just to help me make more sense of the game. That being said, however, the iPad was actually very cumbersome to film. You might have seen me having some problems with it. It was kind of hard to focus on the iPad, where sometimes you wouldn't be able to read everything, see what was... I think you guys were able to see what was going on, but you definitely weren't able to read anything. So I don't know if I'm probably going to limit the iPad games to mostly or anything based on an app, to mostly off the channel, because the only way I could think to film an app-based game is if I were to find the app on like Steam or something like that. I have to film out here in the living room and then be recording the app the entire time, and being able to splice in the footage of the app along with my voice, that would probably get very cumbersome in a hurry. So I think I'm probably going to limit app-based games off the channel. So unfortunately, you guys probably aren't going to see any more app-based games, but I will likely continue that campaign that was started on the channel. So I think that's enough rambling on the Star Wars Imperial Assault front. Next, another new game, another one on the list in Metal Dawn. Metal Dawn from Everything Epic Games was where we get dumped. We have a military AI going sentient and wants to exterminate the world. And we have to try to stop it using a team of agents representing basically the various governments of the world. Oh, the less said about this game, the better. But we're in a recap, so we're going to try to break it down. So my first impression... So I will go full disclosure on this one. My first impressions of this game, even before I got it on the channel, were not good. This is one of those games where I like the theme, and I think that's the last redeeming thing I'm going to say about this game. The execution, I did not like the execution of this one at all. So this is one game where I kind of I feel like it needs several house rules before I want to get it back to the table. The one house rule I came up with, and I probably still flubbed it in the video, is there are ways during the Dominus phase when you're going through attacks to spawn additional enemies out on the board. So the house rule I had when I was going through my playthrough on the channel is if enemies spawn during the Dominus phase, they don't... So if you're going through, say you're going through like Zone 3 attacks and you hit a firewall, for instance, that makes you spawn additional drones on the board. Rules as written, those drones would also attack, and if you get into an undefended zone, you'd fly through the Metal Dawn track at the top of the board very, very quickly. So so basically the house rule I had there was if it spawns during the Dominus phase while you're going through attacks, the new enemies that you spawn don't attack. I think there are some other games that have a similar rule in place. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but think of like Summoning Sickness from Magic the Gathering, for instance, or anything that enters exhausted in Keyforge. It's the exact same idea. So that's the one house rule I really was able to come up with right off the top of my head, but I feel like it needs more than that before this is going to get anywhere near my table or the channel again, for that matter. Like I said, it was a good theme, but miserable execution. So yeah, and as I called it in that video, I called it throw through the window bad, and my opinion has not changed in the slightest on that one. So now I'm going to probably I'm probably going to try to forget that I've got Metal Dawn. But we have one last game that actually just went up this morning in Atlantic Chase. Atlantic Chase was the first of 4 games from GMT Games that's on my TAC Up Wargaming list. I'm probably going to feature more GMT games on the channel this year, where you take control of either units from the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy, or the Home Fleet, the British Navy, during World War II between 1939 and 1942. The scenario we played was the first blockade scenario, Raiders of the North Atlantic, and it didn't end well for us, unfortunately. Grand Admiral Raider got very much relieved of command, probably executed for how miserable the scenario went, but I do like that it includes tutorial scenarios to teach you everything needed to play the game. As I've been getting into wargaming, I think that's one thing I've kind of felt a little bit spoiled about with companies like Fantasy Flight, who put out learn-to-play guides where you can be like, okay, you're walking through the game, you're walking through like a turn, you walk through like a couple turns just to see how everything works. And then you can play along with that to help you learn the game. And even a game like Twilight Inscriptions even got, you run through your first, I think, like 4 turns, then you actually do faction setup, then you play through the game like normal. So I've gotten a little bit spoiled with the learn-to-play guides. And I do like that Atlantic Chase really gave you those tutorial scenarios to help you teach everything in the game. Now, I've heard people say that it's a very different game from anything that they've ever played. I didn't really get that feeling, but I think a lot of that is just coming from the fact that I'm still so new to wargaming, so I look at most of these systems and I'm like, ooh, this is new, ooh, this is new. So I don't really have that other frame of reference from these other games to be like, okay, I feel how this is different from such and such. Maybe I'll get that way as I'm kind of going in the reverse direction where Atlantic Chase was one of the first games I picked up, and then I pick up other stuff later on. So maybe I'll get the feeling that way on how these games might feel different. It does seem I guess another thing I've heard is that's a little bit abstract, and I guess I can kind of see that where you're more like the admirals more like the dueling admirals on the map. There's definitely a lot of content to dig into here, though. I don't know how many scenarios there were. I didn't count from the solitaire scenario book, but there's also 2-player scenarios, which are probably the same scenarios, but you just play them with 2 players. There might be more because there might be some scenarios that aren't conducive to playing solitaire rules, and then there are even advanced scenarios once you dig into all of the other scenarios in the box. And it is a bit of a time investment to learn. It took me, I want to say, between 4 and 6 sessions to get the feel to get through all of the tutorial scenarios where I was like, okay, now I can actually feature this game on the channel. Now I'm at a point where I'm comfortable running this game, kind of showing it off on the channel, and playing it through without feeling like a total scrub. But again, if I made any mistakes in that or any of my playthroughs, I do welcome constructive feedback in the comments section on any video. So with that, that's all the games. So let's go ahead and talk about Mystical Munchies. As you might remember from the test episode that I filmed of Mystical Munchies, the no-bake cookies I made actually flopped pretty hard due to being way too dry. I think it's more likely that I boiled the mixture for too long. There was also a thought that the soy milk wasn't a good substitute for the regular skim milk. I'll probably have to try the recipe again with both kinds of milks just to see. But from a technical standpoint, I think the filming actually went pretty well. And it seems to be a segment that people are interested in. I'm not getting inundated with comments of, hey, when are you bringing Mystical Munchies back? Hey, when are you bringing Mystical Munchies back? But I think we are going to go ahead with it as a segment. And I mentioned this during the test episode, but what we're going to do is we're going to pick out for each month we're going to pick a cookbook and we're going to cook several recipes in it. So we'll do an appetizer first, then we'll do a side dish, then we'll do an entree, then a dessert, and then for months that have 5 Saturdays, and then we'll do a drink as well. I don't know what day I'm actually going to film on. I was going to film on Saturdays, but our group started, but I've got a group now that's going to get together and play big board games every other Saturday, so I need to figure out a day for that. It might end up being Sunday after the game video for the week goes up. I could probably make that work, especially if I try to do most of my prep on Saturday. So with that in mind, I will go ahead and unveil the first cookbook that we're going to be cooking out of. We're actually going to first feature, I'll bring it in shot here, the Dungeon Meister Cookbook. 75 RPG-inspired recipes to level up your game night. So the first recipe we're going to do is the appetizer And the recipe that we're going to do out of here, let me see if I can find it. Here we go. Page 85. So the first recipe we're going to be making is the necklace of fireballs, which is aka coconut chicken nuggets with tropical sauce. So that should be an interesting recipe to make. With that, let's go ahead and let's preview the games coming to the channel in March. So the games that are coming to the channel in March, we're going to lead the month off with Gaia Project again. I featured this on the channel multiple times, but this will be the first time I'm featuring it on Wednesday to see where I like it as a weeknight video. I think it'll work as a weeknight video, but I want to try it for sure. Plus, I actually made some changes to my normal weekly schedule on Wednesday, so it should be a little bit easier to feature some of these. It should be a little bit easier to feature these edge games where they're right on the edge of I should stick to them on a Sunday, or I think they can work as a weeknight video. So it'll be a little easier to feature those games. Then we're also going to do a pandemic month on the channel to commemorate the 3-year anniversary of the COVID-19 pandemic. So on every Sunday of the month, we're going to play a different game in the pandemic system. So we're going to lead off with Star Wars: The Clone Wars, which is also going to be new to the channel. Fall of Rome, Reign of Cthulhu, and WoW Wrath of the Lich King, none of which are going to be new to the channel. And then as far as the other games that we're going to play on Wednesday, we're going to feature The Hunters from GMT Games, which is not on my TACUP Wargaming list, but as I've explored Wargaming, that's a game it's a series I've really liked as I've explored those historical war games, which will also be new to the channel. As will Call to Adventure and Red Rising also be new to the channel. Then we're going to step into the background campaign for Hero Realms again. As far as what's currently out, we're in the last scenario of that, but there was a Kickstarter for Hero Realms that just funded probably a couple weeks ago, and I did back that. So there'll be more content on that coming probably next year. In the meantime, we might go through the background camp. We might go through Hero Realms again with a different character. Anyway, on that note, let's go ahead and wrap this video up. So that's the recap for February. Wednesday we'll play Gaia. We'll be playing, as I mentioned, Wednesday we'll be playing Gaia Project. Next week we'll be start Pandemic Month with Star Wars: The Clone Wars. And probably later Sunday is my thought right now. We'll feature the first recipe for Mystical Munchies out of the Dungeon Meister cookbook with those coconut chicken nuggets with coconut sauce, with tropical sauce. Thank you for watching the video. Please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Be sure to turn on notifications so you get my content. Be well, stay safe, take care of yourselves and your loved ones, and I'll be back with more videos in the future. Until then, take care everyone.